Okay, shall we go ahead and call to order the Vision Committee meeting for Wednesday, the 23rd, 2018. It's 4 o'clock, and I know there's lots of, the audience has filled up and they want to get home early. Okay, give a guy a few days off and he gets humorous, not a problem.
We missed you, Mayor.
Sure, but your aim's getting,
Ashley drew a much bigger crowd.
that's what I saw.
But I didn't have any jokes.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, well, at least we're not underwater here. Okay.
Gotcha. So it is.
Want me to call?
Yes, would you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Dorito,
Here.
Councilmember Gonzalez,
Here.
Councilmember Hamrick,
Here.
Councilmember Jaquez, Councilmember Meisner,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Smith,
Here.
Mayor Troutman.
Here. Okay, we would have a presentation regarding the certified local government from DOLA. The gentleman from DOLA would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Mark Rodman. I am the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer. I work with History Colorado. And actually, I was looking at Ryan and smiling a moment ago because we're not a division of DOLA. We work a lot with DOLA, but we're not part of the Department of Local Affairs.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
And what then is who are you with again?
I'm with History Colorado.
History Colorado.
We're a division of the Colorado Department of Higher Education.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to just dig right in then?
Of course, I'd love to do that. I appreciate you guys having me here today to talk a little bit about the Certified Local Government Program. And what the Certified Local Government Program is a partnership between the federal government, the state government, and local governments, be it a municipality or a county, to work with historic preservation. It's really giving the local groups a way to participate in the National Historic Preservation Act and the things that go on with historic properties. So to be a certified local government, you go in, I'll talk about the qualifications in a moment, but what you're doing basically is going in and saying that we're going to operate a preservation program at the local level, and we're going to follow the National Historic Preservation Act, and we're going to follow what's called the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, which means that when you're working on a property, there's certain standards the federal government puts out for historic properties and that you will follow those. So that's a little bit real quickly about what the program is, and what I want to do first is just give you an idea of our breadth across the state and the different types of communities that we serve. Oops, there we go. It's a little hard to tell on the screen, but if you look up there, we have 61 certified local governments in Colorado. The names that you probably can't read from back there are the cities that are certified local governments, and the counties that have the blue are the counties that are certified local governments. So we work with both groups, and that shows you our breadth across the state and the different communities we work with. To give you an idea of the different communities we work with, our first community I wanted to show you was Longmont, Colorado, because that was our first certified local government from 1985. Our newest certified local government, which is from earlier this year, is Lahana. So they've just been certified a couple months. Our largest certified local government is Denver. And our smallest is Starkville with a population of 59. So we're really excited to show that the program really works for all types of communities, all sizes, and a lot of different things are happening in those communities based with historic preservation. So I'm going to run through the benefits, and then I'll talk a little bit about what you'd have to do to become a certified local government. The first thing that happens is once you're certified, there is a pool of grant money that comes from the federal government that we're required to give out to the certified local governments to do historic preservation projects. And in most states, there's a 40% match required from local governments, but because we have the State Historical Fund, which is the money that comes from the gaming towns of Cripple Creek, Central City, and Black Hawk, we pay that 40% match for the certified local governments, which means we have a grant program which you guys can apply to, which there is no match for you to apply and participate in. So it's no match for local governments. And this is not a bricks and mortar program, but it is a preservation survey and promotion program. So you can go in and you can do things like survey for historic buildings to determine what is historic and what meets qualifications. You can do things like what I have shown in this slide, which this is a interpretive panel that the city of Pueblo did for the Steelworks Museum in Pueblo. And so what they did, they applied to us, they got money, and they put up interpretive panels for that museum through this certified local government program. So it was a way for them to get money to do interpretive signage. We also do things like walking tours. Right now, one of the grants we have out is with Cortez, and they're doing a historic walking tour along their main street so people can take the podcast, walk down the street, learn about the historic buildings and what's going on. So there's a lot of heritage tourism operations type things with that. One of the things that we get the most requests from, though, is the survey to figure out what's historic and what would be eligible for some of the other benefits that we have. This is one that was completed a couple years ago in Westminster. They took some neighborhoods that had ranch houses, and they wanted to see if any of those were possibly historic. And so they did a survey of ranch homes. And out of the ones that they did, they surveyed probably 100 homes, and they found about 15 out of those that still retained their historic character from when they were originally built that might be eligible for some of the programs that we have. So they were working with that. And then I mentioned Cortez a minute ago. They did a Main Street survey recently to determine what was historic along Main Street. So you can see that. And then Boulder County, which is a CLG, they went and surveyed some archaeological resources in a park that they had. That way they can interpret those for people that came to that park. So now they're looking to us to possibly come to a grant for some interpretive signage to talk about the history of that area of the park in Boulder County. So that's a little bit quick summary of the CLG grant program and what you can do with that. I want to move on and talk a minute about Starkville and them becoming a CLG, because one of the things that they wanted to do when they became a CLG is they had this schoolhouse. As you can see, it's been abandoned actually since the 1960s sitting there. But they do not have a city hall in Starkville. It's 59, has a population of 59. And so they want to take this old schoolhouse and they want to make it a city hall and a community center. So the reason that they became a CLG is because they were able to go in and do survey to figure out what was historic in the town, including the school. And then they're working to get this school listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And the reason that they're doing that is because they want to be eligible for tax credits and for grants from the State Historical Fund to be able to do the project that they want to do. And so in working through this, in their mind, there's ways they can do this for very little money, because they can go in and they can get DOLA grants to help make this their city hall. They can match that with State Historical Fund money. They can also work through it takes some legal maneuvers, but they can work through some legal maneuvers to make this where it could be a tax credit project for state historic preservation tax credits. So the Certified Local Government Program has been something that they have really jumped on and moved through. They've only been certified a couple years, but especially for a small municipality of only 59, it's amazing what they've been able to do to try to move through to take care of their goal. And their goal really is to make this a city hall, and then they have some other buildings on the commercial strip that they want to be able to revitalize and put businesses back in, because they're dilapidated now, and being able to get those tax credits involved in those is what they're looking for. So I want to use that to move into the tax credits that we have. As you may or may not be familiar, the tax credits that we have for the state for historic preservation were just reauthorized by the legislature in this last session. In the next couple of weeks, the governor will be signing that legislation into law. We're very excited because the tax credit that we had sunsetted at the end of 2019. As you may or may not know, all tax credits in Colorado have to have a sunset date. They can't go on forever. And so we went through the legislative program this time, and we were able to take that and get that expanded to 2029. So we're really excited about the fact that we've got another 10 years after the sunset date for that tax credit. And the reason that's important for you guys is that anything a certified local government lists as historic, as long as the building is 50 years old, qualifies for historic tax credits as long as you're going to do a project that follows the Secretary of Interior standards. So for commercial buildings, if it's a project that is $2 million or more, it's a 20% tax credit. If it is a project that is $2 million or under, it's a 25% tax credit. So all the work that you do on that project to get it rehabbed, to get it back into use, you can get either a 20 or 25% tax credit on doing that project. Now, the great thing about the tax credit for commercial buildings is, say you have a building that's 3 stories, and originally on the first floor it was retail, and on the second 2 floors it was office space. You can go into that building, you can take the first floor, and you can turn it into a restaurant, and you can take the second 2 floors, and you can turn them into apartments. Well, there's a lot of things that are going to be needed in that building to make that happen that's not historic. And so if you're going to put in a restaurant, you have to have a commercial kitchen. Believe it or not, historic tax credits will pay for that commercial kitchen. So you can take a 20 or 25% tax credit on all the restaurant equipment you have to bring in to make it a restaurant, because if you want it to be a restaurant, you cannot reuse that building without a commercial kitchen. So the tax credits are like, yeah, we want this historic building reused, we can pay for that. If you're going and you're doing the apartments on the second, third floor, and they used to be offices where you're not going to have bathrooms, you're not going to have kitchens, you're going to have to put all those in. So the historic tax credits will pay for that to be done. So when people talk about historic preservation, they all think that, oh, you can't do anything, you can't make anything happen. Well, you do have to follow certain guidelines. When you're driving down the street and look at the building, you basically want it to look like it always has historically. If it has any great features inside that are historic, you want to maintain those. But you can do things to make it different types of businesses and different types of uses than what you've had in the past. So there's great ways to do that. As far as residential, you can also use the tax credits on anything that's been designated by CLG to get tax credits on that, and that is a 20% tax credits for work you do on your property. And the great thing about the historic tax credits for residential properties is going to pay for things you're going to have to do anyway. If you have to have a new roof on your house, you can get tax credits for putting a new roof on your house as long as you're listed. If you need to upgrade your electrical system inside because it's historic and it's really old, you can put in a brand new electrical system. You can put in HVAC, you can put in plumbing, you can work on your siding, you can work on your foundation, you can repair your windows, your doors, any of the stuff on the interior as far as any plaster or drywall, those type of things. I will mention this is probably more than you want to know right now, but just so that you know, you can go in and repair things that are in your kitchen or in your bathroom, but you cannot remodel kitchens and baths with the historic tax credits. If you ask why, I can just tell you, you used to be able to do that with the tax credits, and somebody in Boulder went in and they put in granite countertops and bought a $5,000 refrigerator, and they got tax credits for that. That sent the legislature overboard. They went crazy. So they changed the kitchen and bath regulations so that you can repair what's there, but you can't put anything new in. So if you got cabinets, you can repair them, you can fix those, but you can't put in new cabinetry and that type of thing. So again, that's probably more detail than you guys need right now, but give you a little bit about that. So if you guys have a designation program and you designate buildings and you're not a certified local government, you do not qualify for this program. I get asked a lot why you have to be a certified local government by law to qualify for this program. And the reason that you do is that the legislature was terrified that every mayor and every city in Colorado would say anything that was over 50 years old was historic, so everybody could take the tax credit. And they wanted to make sure that's not what was happening, that the tax credit was actually being used for historic buildings and homes across the state. The certified local government program, you have to have criteria set up about how you designate things, and that gave the legislature some confidence that people would indeed be actually using tax credits for historic buildings. So I want to give you a couple of examples of things that have happened with historic buildings because of this. This is the old Oddfellows building in Newcastle in Garfield County, and it had been sitting vacant for a while. And a dentist came and said, there's no dentist in Newcastle. We'd love to locate in Newcastle and have something happening there. So they ended up buying this building, and they used tax credits to redo this building. I don't know why I didn't do this, but these are pictures of it before it was rehabbed. I didn't put in the rehab picture. I don't know why I did that. But anyway, but it tells you a little bit about what they spent, how much state tax credit they got to do that. And the great thing for the town of Newcastle is now you don't have to drive to Glenwood Springs to go to the dentist. You can go to the dentist right there in town because this dentist was able to move into this building, and this is right there on their main street.
When you say project cost, does that include the cost of the building?
No, you cannot take tax credits for the cost of the building.
Just, okay.
You can only do that for the rehab.
Okay.
And then this is in Trinidad. They've taken the Trinidad Opera House and they're turning that into several different businesses throughout there. And this project is an ongoing project. They project the project to be $1.7 million. They're looking at taking tax credits of $525,000 to make that and revitalize that building on Main Street. Recently, when we were working to renew the tax credits, we had the mayor of Trinidad come, and he actually testified in front of the legislature. And his comment was that before they became a certified local government and started using the tax credit program, that 70% of the businesses on storefronts on Main Street were vacant. And now because they have this incentive, that only 30% of the storefronts are vacant. And this is one of 3 tax credit projects they have going on now in Trinidad. So they really, really are taking advantage of this program. And I think it's making a difference in their economy. Of course, they have other things that are making a difference in their economy. They're doing really well with the marijuana business. But anyway, I think this has helped as well.
Yes, a question. This example and the previous, you had state tax credit. There was no federal tax credit available for these projects?
Not in these two, because the federal tax credits, you have to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places to get those. This building here could actually have gotten the federal tax credits, and I'll be honest with you, I can't tell you why they decided not to run down that road. The building in Newcastle, they never worked to get that listed on the National Register. And to give you an idea, these tax credits, you do not have to be a certified local government to get. You have to have the building either listed on the National Register, the State Register, or through a certified local government. The problem with the state and national register is that there's a lot more paperwork that goes along with that. People usually have to hire somebody to write those nominations, so they can get complicated. Being on the state register takes about 9 months. To get on the national register, that's after you submit the nomination. And then to get on the national register, it takes about a year. And so usually with certified local governments and their processes, that's usually about 60 days. So people that are looking at a project and wanting to get listed can do that much more quickly. And with the state and national register, your building's going to have to be more pristine and more historic as far as the character of the building. It looks just like it did when it was built and that kind of thing. You can't have as much alteration. And what you see with the local governments is they're a little more forgiving when they're making that decision. I mean, you still got to kind of look like you did historically, but they're much more forgiving about that. And that gives people who would not normally have an opportunity to be on the National Register or the State Register a chance at these tax credits too. Now, you know, if you could start where you would just list anything that anybody brought in that was 50 years old, that would be a problem, and we'd have a problem with your certified local government status. But again, people tend to be more lenient with the local governments and what they list than what you're going to find on the state register, and we don't have a problem with that.
And so kind of a follow-up question, if that building there had been on the National Register, would both tax credits been available to it?
It would have, yes, and you can stack those tax credits. So, and that tax credit's a 20% tax credit. It's only for commercial buildings, not for residential, but for commercial buildings, it's a 20% tax credit. If you're getting 25% of the state, you're looking at getting 45% of your project paid for in tax credits when you do that. And you guys are lucky because you do have the National Register District downtown with contributing buildings on that, so you do have a lot of buildings through that process that would be eligible for both in working through that. So you do have that opportunity. I wanted to point this out. This one's in Silverton. This is a hotel they did in Silverton. And as you can see, this one had both the federal and the state tax credits. And so the project cost was $2 million. And they got $600,000 in state tax credits and $400,000 in federal tax credits. So they basically had half of their project paid for with the tax credits. So a pretty good deal for those guys when you're looking at and trying to make this a viable investment for them to make these things happen. So that's really my presentation about that. The one other thing I wanted to mention that I mentioned briefly when we were talking about the building in Starkville is that anything that you would list locally as a CLG would also be eligible for the State Historical Fund Grants Program. And that program is available to nonprofits and governmental entities. So if you have a privately owned building, it's very difficult to get state historical funds, but not impossible. A private individual or a private business cannot apply to the State Historical Fund, but they can apply through a nonprofit or a local government to do that. So if you had a project downtown that was privately owned and they want a State Historical Fund grant to do a project, you guys could apply on their behalf. The only thing about that is you're responsible to make sure the money gets spent correctly, not the private individual, because the state contract would be with Canyon City and not with the individual owner. You would make that contract with them, so you would have to oversee that. The other thing is if you're going to give money to a privately owned building, then you would have to make sure there is some public purpose for that. And so a public purpose is not, well, we'd love to have a new restaurant in town and they're going to put a new restaurant in there. Won't that be great? That'll really help our economy. A public purpose, say, for a restaurant is they're going to go in, they're going to put in a restaurant. They're going to have this back room that's going to sit about 20 people. And we don't have good meeting space for nonprofit groups here in Canyon City for that size. And they're going to let people use that space for free if they're a nonprofit. Doesn't mean they don't charge them for food. It means that, hey, we got this great meeting space that we need here in the city. Suddenly that restaurant that was not a public benefit has a public benefit because you have a place that you have a space that you need for people to gather to do those kind of things. You know, so those type of things can be doing that. Say, and I don't really know whether you guys have anybody that lives on the second and third floors of the buildings downtown, but if you do not, you can say, well, we don't have anybody that's living on the second and third floors of our downtown buildings, and we really want to promote that mixed use. So the first person that does that, we're going to go in and support a grant for them because we hope that's going to generate that type of thing throughout our whole downtown. And that's a huge public benefit for people to be able to see that works. Now, if you have 2 or 3 that are already doing that, that argument's not going to get you anywhere. But if you haven't had that happen in downtown, that's another way to get a public benefit for a privately owned piece of property. And if you have that situation, you want to talk about that, we can always talk about that later for that particular situation. But just wanted to throw that out there. Those state historical fund grants, if you're a nonprofit or a local government and the building is owned by that nonprofit or local government, there's a 25% match. If you are privately owned, there's a 50% match. So it does matter who owns the building as far as what the match requirements are. So that's a lot of talk about the different benefits that you have between the certified local government grants, the tax credits, and the state historical fund grants. But what do you need to do to be a CLG? Well, the first thing you have to do is pass a preservation ordinance, and that preservation ordinance has to include several things. First of all, it has to include some kind of designation process and designation criteria. What do you have to have to be a certified, I mean, to be listed as historic here in Canyon City? So you'd have to come up with those criteria and have that set in your preservation ordinance. And then once you have things that are designated, and let me go back to that. One of the things about designation is you can set designation up to be only by owner consent. So so if I come in there and I'm riding down the street and I see Ryan's property that he owns and I'm like, man, I love that property. I'm gonna go get it designated because I want to make sure it's got protection. You can set up your ordinance where it doesn't do that so that only Ryan can nominate his property to be listed. Or if you want to, you can always have it where somebody else can nominate the property if you'd like to do that. To give you, most of the rural communities have owner consent only. But some communities like Denver, they have where non-owners can designate properties. But honestly, when it gets to the city council there, unless this is something so special that everybody in Denver almost says it has to be preserved, they're never going to do it. In the last 2 years, there have been 3 non-consensual nominations put forward to the city of Denver. The council has approved none of them because there were individual homes that the neighborhood didn't want somebody to tear down and build something else there, and they were trying to stop that from happening in the neighborhood. And the council's like, no, we feel like the private property rights trumps what these people are trying to do. This is not such a special place that we feel like we all got to jump behind it. But again, you guys get to decide what's in your ordinance as far as designation. Do you want owner consent? Do you want other people to be able to offer something up and then make the decision after it's been nominated? That would be totally up to you. The other thing that the National Park Service, which is the federal entity that oversees this program, requires is that if somebody has a property that's listed, then when they do work on that property, when they come to get a building permit from you guys, that it has to go before your Preservation Commission to be reviewed for the work that they're doing. Now, if you're listed in Boulder and you go before the Preservation Commission, they're going to tell you what color to paint your house. And if you paint it a different color, they're going to fine you. They're going to make you paint it back the color it was or the color they tell you. And there's going to be all kind of things about it because that works for Boulder, and they're happy with that. To give you an example, if you go out to Cortez and you go in and you're going to do a project, you go in there, they'll say, they'll talk with you, say, well, this seems to meet the Secretary of Interior standards. This doesn't seem to meet the Secretary of Interior standards. But we think if you do it this way, then everything would be great. And you meet the Secretary of Interior standards, and everything would be fine. The person can look at them and say, thank you, and then go do what they want to. Because what the National Park Service requirements for CLG says is you must have that design review. It does not say that you have to have mandatory enforcement. And what Cortez will tell you is that when people come in to get things reviewed in Cortez, about 50% of the people say, hey, we never thought about it that way. We want to meet the Secretary of Interior standards. We'll do it the way you're asking us to do it. And about 50% of people say, thank you for your time. We're going to do what we want to do anyway. And so the only recourse that the city of Cortez has is if somebody changes that building so much that it does not look like it did historically, they can delist the building, and that way the person doesn't have the opportunity for these benefits. But, if they're not doing that and they're sending things to the tax credit process that don't look like they do historically, then they would have a problem with certification anyway. So nobody forces them to do anything to force people to do it. The only thing they can do is decide whether you remain listed or not. And quite frankly, Cortez has not delisted anything, because people have done things they really didn't want them to do, but nothing that they felt like changed the property so much it should be delisted. So those are the things that you have to have in your ordinance, and you do have to have at least a 5-member preservation commission that will do the reviews of these projects. Now, the way that it works with the Preservation Commission is they review things to be designated, and then they would bring that designation, if they approve it, to the city council and say, we recommend that you pass an ordinance to a resolution to designate this property. So the ultimate decision about whether to designate something or not would be yours. Yours would be based on a recommendation by that commission. So they're not running around willy-nilly, listing things and saying this is the way it's going to be. They're making recommendations to you guys to make those listings. Now, as far as design review, the way that's typically set up is they do make design review decisions as far as whether somebody can or can't do something. If you guys would decide to make their decisions mandatory, then what happens is if somebody does not like their decision, they would appeal to you as the city council and say, we don't believe what they're saying is right or wrong. I mean, it's the way we should go, and we want you to overturn that, and you would have the right to overturn that. Obviously, if they're not able to enforce what they're suggesting as far as their review, it doesn't need to come to you, because people can do it anyway. So the 2 things in the ordinance are that you must be able, well, the 3 things I guess I should say, is you have to have a commission, you have to have criteria for listing things and be listing things, and then you also have to have a design review process, and again, it does not have to be mandatory. So that's my quick overview of the program, the benefits of it, and the requirements. There's a few other requirements, but they're really not anything that's that big a deal that makes a difference. Those are the things that you guys are going to really care about and be concerned about. So with that, I'll turn it over to you if you have any other questions.
When you do that, the tax credit thing, that's private money. Do you get some kind of certificate that says you will get after the project is done? Is it state tax? Is it federal tax? What tax are you talking about?
It's state income tax if you're doing state
Just
tax
state.
credits. It's federal income tax if you're on the National Register of Historic Places and you're doing a federal income tax project. We have a form that we provide to you guys, because if you're doing a residential project, it goes totally through our department. If you're doing a commercial project, it's a partnership with the Office of Economic Development. You apply through the Office of Economic Development. So with residential projects, we issue you a certificate that you turn in with your tax return.
Okay.
If you're doing commercial project, the Office of Economic Development will give you a certificate to do that. And then you have 10 years to take that credit. So, if you get $10,000 in tax credits for work that you've done on your house, and you're paying, about $1,000 a year in income tax, you don't have to pay income tax for that 10-year period because you've got that certificate.
What's the downside?
What's the downside? To me, there's not a whole lot of downside to this, because to do these projects, you do have to, if you're doing the tax credit projects, you are going to have to follow certain guidelines in doing so. If you want to go in and you want to replace all your windows, and your windows are a little ratty, but they're not in too bad a shape, we're going to tell you, no, you're not going to be able to do that and get your tax credits. You're going to have to fix the windows that you have. So there is some things that do that. However, unless you guys have mandatory enforcement, all we can tell you is that you can change those windows if you want to. We just can't give you tax credits for that project. To give you an example, there's a church in Evergreen that wanted tax credits, and it's now an arts center. And they wanted to change out a bunch of stuff to do that. And we went and walked around with them, and their ideas weren't that bad about what they wanted to do, but they changed the character of the building too much. So what we told them was that there was no reason they couldn't do, they were listed, and there was no reason they couldn't do what they wanted to do. Nobody could tell them they can't do that, but what we could tell them was if they do it that way, they wouldn't qualify for the program, get the tax credits, because they would not meet the Secretary of Interior standards. And so if they wanted the tax credits, they would have to change the way they did the project. But other than that, there would be nothing else said to them. They could do whatever they wanted to do. They ultimately decided to change their project a little bit because they really wanted the tax credits because they needed that benefit to make it all work. But that was their decision. It was no pressure from us. It was just if you wanted entree to that program to do that. So in a little bit more answer to your question, if you have a program that requires owner consent for listing, I really don't see the downside of it because people are making the decision to participate themselves, and then they're also making the decision to follow the guidelines to get that benefit.
Well, you know, it sounds too good to be true.
Of course it does, but I really am not looking for a way to skirt that issue.
No, and
yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
What about, could they sell the building in a year or two?
Well,
Is there a
that's-
detainer on that?
No, that's the great thing. The tax credits that we've had tax credits since 1990 for historic preservation. In 2014, and in 2014, they updated them and changed them. And so now, it used to be that you had to hold on to your property for 5 years after you did a tax credit, got tax credits. They changed that because the legislature decided, and this really came from the legislature, not from any of us pushing it, that like, why do we care if somebody holds on to a property? If somebody that's flipping properties, they go in there and they improve that property, they make it worth more, they get it back into use, why do we care if they're flipping it? So now, you cannot change ownership while you're doing the project. But as soon as you get the certificate in your hand that says you have the tax credits, the very next day, if you want to sell it, you can sell it. You retain the tax credit, somebody else owns the building. But you just can't change in midstream. You have to have continual ownership through the whole project.
Okay. Anyone else?
Are you familiar with how Salida, they're a certified local government, are they not?
They are certified local government.
Yeah, are you familiar with how it works for them? I believe that their review results in mandatory requirements for projects.
Yeah, it's interesting that you ask about Salida just because there's 61 and I can't always remember who does what, but I do remember that Salida is one that does have mandatory compliance. So what they decide, as far as the commission decides, is the way that it goes in Salida. And then again, you have the opportunity to appeal to council if you don't like that decision. And I really don't know, how it's gone in Salida, but in most cases, every now and again, most cities and towns and counties have something that's overturned because the council feels like the commission's been too rough on somebody. So they do get overturned from time to time. And I can't say in Salida if they've had that, but I'm assuming they probably had.
We did talk to an official up there, and his comment on it was on the mandatory part of it, was that part of it kept people from doing the wrong thing, is how he phrased it.
Right. And I think, to me, that is the benefit for having mandatory, if you guys feel like your community will accept that, is you can make sure that somebody doesn't go in there and just totally destroy a building that's very important in your downtown by changing it to something that, just doesn't fit with everything else that's in town. So it's nice to have mandatory compliance, but you have to feel like that your community will accept that. And some do and some don't.
And I have a question. Did I see on your map that Florence is a CLG?
They are.
And that's pretty recent, isn't it?
That was from 2016, I think.
And do you know how many buildings became designated as?
I'll be honest with you, I don't know how many they designated.
And do you know if
since
any
then.
of them have utilized any of the grant monies?
They have used grants, and I can't tell you which buildings they are grant-wise. They have not utilized any tax credits, but I know that the city of Florence itself is working to promote the tax credits. They were actually very supportive and made some calls in support of the tax credit getting renewed and everything. So I know they're looking forward to using it, but they have not used it so far.
And another question, at what point does a historic building no longer qualify as being historic?
Well, that is something that I can't say this is definitely when it does and when it doesn't. When you go in and designate a historic property, what you're going to look at in the designation is you're going to call out the features that make it historic. And being historic can be it's a little tricky as far as how it goes, because if you're designating something because of the architecture, it has to be pretty pristine and like it was historically, or what we say is within its historic period of significance. Because if you have a building that was, say, a business on Main Street and it operated for 50 years, that entire 50 years is its period of historic significance. So it doesn't have to look like it did the day that it was built. It has to look like at least like it did the last day it operated for whatever reason you're designated. Say it was the hardware store that everybody used for 50 years and that's why you're designated, and it closed in 1970. If it looked like it did in 1970, but not so much like it did in 1920 when it was built, you're still good as far as the characteristics, but it has to look like it did during the time that it was important. If you're designating something because somebody important did something there or because a big important event happened there, then you don't worry so much about does it look like it did originally. You still want to have some look like it did, so if the person that was important came back, they would know that was their place. But if there's been some changes, you can be a little more lenient. So that's when you're designated that way. So once it's designated, as it goes through life after that designation, you're going to look and see, does it maintain the characteristics for which it was designated? So if somebody's in there and they're just changing it up a whole lot and making it look totally different because they're wanting to modernize it, make it look totally modern on the outside, then you may get to a point where you're like, gosh, all the characteristics that made it historic originally, they don't exist anymore. We need to delist that property. The same thing could happen if somebody doesn't maintain their property. It starts falling in and it can't be fixed, and all that it had, say, a lot of ornamental elements on the outside, and those are now gone and deteriorated. Then you may say, it doesn't have enough of that characteristic anymore, we need to delist it.
So, and on the reverse side, what if there was a historic building that chose not to be designated? And could they, at a future date, petition to become designated?
Oh, absolutely. The thing about designation is you can really do that at any point in time. It's just to take advantage of these programs, you're going to have to be designated by somebody, either on the National Register, the State Register, or by a certified local government to be able to take advantage of these programs. So, and you can do that at any time. I mean, you know, we have buildings that sit that we won't designate for, oh, that's such a great building, we hope somebody designates, and the owners don't want to do it, and then they own it for 20 years, and they sell it to somebody, and the first thing somebody else wants to do is designate it because they want to get some tax credits. So, yeah, you don't have to, there's not a period of time that you have to designate. To qualify for these programs, it has to be at least 50 years old to be designated. However, there's places in Colorado, municipalities, that they have like a 30-year limit for designation. So they'll designate things that are only 30 years old. But those things that are designated can't take advantage of these programs because the state programs require it to be 50 years old to take advantage
How
of that.
competitive is it to get grants?
Well, as far as the grants go, we have 2 rounds in the State Historical Fund. And to get those grants, we give out between 50 and 60% of the grant applications that we get every time. Probably about 10 or 15% of that, it doesn't matter if we had the money, the grants are so poorly written or what they're planning to do is so terrible, we wouldn't give them the grant anyway. But that still shows you there's some that we would like to give grants to that we're not able to get grants to. With the Certified Local Government program, it's about 50-50. It's about 50% of the grants that we get, we are able to give out. And then for the tax credits, the great thing about the residential tax credits are that if everybody in Colorado that had a listed property wanted to do a project on their house the same year, there is no limit. Everybody could do it that same year and everybody get tax credits. We'd just move forward, everybody would be happy. And I didn't mention this earlier, but the cap on the residential tax credits is $50,000. So it's a 20% tax credit. You can do $250,000 worth of work. And you can do more, but you're only going to get $50,000 for the work you do. That resets after 10 years. So if you do some work and then 10 years later you need to do some more work, you can get another $50,000. It's a 10-year period. Or if you sell the property. So if I get $50,000 in tax credits, I sell my house to Ryan, he can get another $50,000 in tax credits resets. With the commercial, there's a $1 million cap on those. And you can get up to $1 million per year, which means if you phase your project, you can get $1 million one year and $1 million the next. And we had a project in Aurora. Stanley Aviation became a marketplace, so it's a place that has restaurants and bars and shops in it. And they did their project in 2 phases. They got $2 million in state tax credits. They got $1 million one year and another $1 million the next year, so you can do that. But with those projects, the thing you need to know is the state has allotted $10 million to give out for commercial tax credits every year. And once that's gone each year, there's no more tax credits until the next year. And so they set aside $5 million for projects that were over $2 million, and they set aside $5 million for projects that were $2 million and under. And the reason they did that is if you're doing a really, really large project, you're going to get $1 million in tax credits. There'd be 10 projects in Colorado, it'd all be done. And they wanted to make sure the smaller projects around the state had a better chance. So to give you an idea, last year we ran out of the $5 million for large projects in May, and we ran out of the 10 million for small projects in November. So because the small projects are asking for smaller amounts of money, we can do more, and it takes more time to get through that amount, but we are giving out the full $10 million every year. So my advice to everybody is always apply as early in the calendar year, because it goes by calendar year, as early in the calendar year as possible. But the worst thing that can happen to you is if you don't get them 1 year, is just apply, as soon as it gets to be January 1st, apply again, and you'll be right there first in line. So it only moves your project back a little bit.
And can those tax credits be used towards things like new roofs and foundations?
They can't be used for additions. It has to be on the historic
Well,
building.
foundations.
Foundations, oh yes, No additions, but anything that's with the historic building. The other thing that's great about the commercial tax credits that I didn't say is that you maybe want to be aware of is they're transferable, which means if I do a project and I get $100,000 in tax credits, but I'm a business that just breaks even, so I'm paying very, very little income tax on my, myself for that business, then I can transfer that tax credit to somebody that can use those tax credits. So, you guys are paying Ryan all kind of money, so he's paying all kind of tax credit. He's paying all kind of taxes. So I'd go to him and say, hey, I really like you. I'm going to give you these tax credits. You can use them. Or more than likely what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to him and say, hey, I got some tax credits, and I'll sell them to you. And right now, the tax credits for the state, for commercial properties, are selling for about 80 to 90 cents on the dollar. And so if you have $100,000 in tax credits, you can sell them for $80,000 to $90,000. Why would somebody pay that? Because they're saving $10,000 to $20,000 on their taxes, so that's money they pocket. And the other person's selling them because they couldn't use them, and they're putting money in their pocket. The nice thing about that, too, is that nonprofits who could not use tax credits, this is new since 2014, nonprofits that couldn't use tax credits prior to this, now they can do a tax credit project. They have no income tax liability, but they can sell those tax credits to do something, to bring money in for their project as well. Local governments, any governmental entity cannot do that, but if you are a nonprofit or a private owner, you can get the tax credits and transfer them. You cannot do that with residential. Residential, if you cannot use that for your own income taxes, you wasted your time filling out the paperwork. But most people have some income tax they're going to pay, so you'll be able to use some of it.
Okay, we need to wrap it up somehow. Mr. Meisner, did you have a question or two?
Who actually gives the approval for a designation? Is that the local agency or the state?
That is the local agency. So you would form a commission, and the commission would review, and they would recommend to you, the council, as to whether that building would be designated or not. So the review and seeing if it really is eligible and everything would be your commission that you set up, but you would make the final decision as whether it's designated or not. That has nothing to do with the state.
In the same way on the limitations, for example, like the window scenario.
Yes, you would decide what meets the criteria. However, you are required to follow the Secretary of Interior standards, and the state is required by the federal government to evaluate the certified local government every 4 years. And if you guys are letting everybody do whatever they want to do, you probably won't maintain your certification. However, I'm just going to be honest with you, we do know that in every community, there's going to be a project or two that we're going to think, oh my gosh, we can't believe that they let them do that. But we're not going to decertify somebody for one project. If it's a pattern, it becomes a problem. But every now and again, if there's one that gets through that we think is just awful, we might make a comment or two, but we're not going to try to decertify anybody because of that. Because it happens everywhere.
Ms. Gonzalez?
When a project comes along, the requirements, are they mostly visually, or are they like materials? So for example, if there was a large building that had a sandstone foundation that they were applying for, does it have to be like materials? So a sandstone foundation would have to go back in, or would they be able to upgrade that to when they redid the foundation or repaired it with a concrete or?
There's a little bit of leeway there. If it's a tax credit project, we're going to say you need to match it if at all possible. Now, if you can show evidence that whatever type of sandstone you have is deteriorating really, really quickly, it's only going to last 10 or 15 years, let's figure out a material that looks like it that can match it. So there is some leeway, but you have to make, if you're going to not use the same materials, you've got to make a good case as to why you're not going to use those materials. And so sometimes that's easy, sometimes that's hard. It's according to what you're doing. Now, as far as locally, you guys make the decision as far as what substitute materials you're willing to allow. And again, if it's really extreme where you're just letting everybody replace anything and everything, we're going to have a problem with that with your certification. But as long as it's thoughtful, you may do things that we wouldn't agree with, but as long as there's been thought put in it, we're not going to argue because it is subjective.
Gotcha, okay.
Ms. Gonzalez?
I have one quick question. I just need a quick answer. We have a home that has already been deemed historical here in Canyon City. We use it for our Chamber of Commerce. A few years back, they redid some of the mortar in between the bricks, and they did it incorrectly. Would this be covered under, would it be covered under this program to fix that?
Yes.
Okay.
We do a lot of that, where people have done something that didn't work out because they tried something.
Yeah.
And we go back and fix it. The last thing I want to say, and then I know you guys need to move on, is that we're talking about, is this okay, is that not okay? Unless it's a tax credit project going through us, we're not going to look at every decision you make. Right now, there's 61 CLGs. We can't keep up with every decision we make. We kind of try to keep up with everybody and what they're doing, and then we have an evaluation every 4 years. So unless somebody comes to us and says, it's a mess what these people are doing, somebody really needs to look into it, we're not investigating it. As long as you're basically following the rules that we give you, which is Secretary of Interior Standards and the National Historic Preservation Act, it really is your program to run.
I guess my last question is for Ryan. If this is something we wanted to pursue, who would oversee it in Canyon City?
I think we'd have to have those discussions and, how we're going to set up the commission and those types of things. There's some requirements on who can be on the commission. There, some, historical background. Was it 20% of the commission?
It's 40%.
40% of the commission, assuming that we have that expertise in the community. So we would have to look at it, but again, the Certified Local Government Program it's another one of those tools that we can put in the box to help attract the investors that we need for economic development and hopefully redevelopment of some of these downtown properties.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you
thank
for
you
your
very
time.
much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, moving on to the more, real exciting portion of the meeting,
14 minutes.
that you've all been waiting for. And Ryan, a presentation of the Downtown Consumer Survey.
Yeah, the mayor and members of council, we did a consumer survey in partnership with the Downtown Merchants Association. We had 888 responses. We're still analyzing some of the data, but these are the highlights and cursory slides and feedback that we've received so far. We had, majority of respondents were from within the city limits. Again, most of those respondents also work within the city. Surprisingly, we saw that the respondents were in the 31 to 60 age group. We were expecting a little bit older age group response, but we did get a lot of feedback in those two age groups, with 31 to 45 and 45 to 60 being almost equal. The response rates were higher amongst women, and when we're talking about downtown and shopping, national averages show somewhere between 70 and 80% of shoppers are female, so it aligns with what we see at a national level as well. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to zoom through this because I know we have another meeting here at the end of this. We did get some feedback, and a lot of this is going to be used by the merchants to help them make some business decisions along when they should be open and what days they should be open. We had a lot of feedback from consumers, both in this part of the survey and in the free format part of the survey, asking for better business hours and better days of operation. A lot of people were showing that they or were not able to shop downtown because they're working during most of the hours, and by the time they get home, a lot of the shops are closed, and when they're home on the weekends, a lot of the shops are closed. So a lot of that feedback came out through the survey process. We did ask when most people eat out. Fridays and Saturdays, not surprisingly, were at the top of the list. Breakfast on Sundays was also very high on the list. We asked, why people are going downtown, mostly shopping, but a lot for the dining and events. We've got some people that are coming to conduct business and meet friends, social gathering. Showed up quite a bit in the survey in the free format fields as well. When it came to what mattered most about downtown Canyon City, this was a forced choice question. So they could only pick one response here, and it came down to dining and social gathering. That was the top priority, with shopping coming in second and events third. We asked, and it looks like not all of my slides showed up here, what prevents folks from going downtown. The fourth response, the one with the longest green bar, pull that up here. Prefer shopping at the mall. But the one next to it was prefer shopping online, the one with the lowest green bar. So what's preventing people from going downtown was the online shopping at Amazon, and some other online retailers. We saw that about 50% of people didn't shop downtown because they didn't know what was offered. So it indicates that marketing and building awareness of the downtown, both from a destination standpoint, but also for individual shops and restaurants, there is some marketing awareness that's lacking there. This is a very busy slide, but we asked what are downtown Canyon City's greatest assets, and handed out a slide because this wasn't in the original packet. But you'll see that restaurants was number one as a general group. We had a lot of different restaurants that showed up individually as being an asset to downtown. But the second highest response was the historic buildings. People recognize that the historic buildings downtown is a huge asset for the downtown area as a whole. And again, that's an important reason to bring Mark in here to talk about CLGs and historic preservation. You'll see some of the other responses here. It was convenience. So we saw a lot of responses. It's close to home. It's easy to get to more than one store at a time. The recent improvements, so street improvements, was also received a lot of votes, and then being very walkable. So the consumers really like the wide sidewalks. They like being able to walk the downtown and really enjoy that aspect of it. As we move into analyzing some of the challenges for downtown, I don't have a graph for it yet, but better store hours, as I mentioned earlier, more variety of shopping and restaurants, safer pedestrian crossings. There were a lot of responses in the comments and the challenges section saying, they don't necessarily feel safe crossing the streets because people don't always stop. Vacant and boarded up buildings is certainly a challenge that was recognized in the survey. And then parking and possibly traffic safety, kind of going back to that pedestrian crossing issue. I also put some takeaways from the Buena Vista and Salida visits, but I'd love to hear some discussion from the council members that went on that trip and what they thought of that trip and how it relates to our downtown. So I'll turn it back to council if you guys would like to discuss that.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Meisner.
I have a question about the survey.
Sure.
What's been the response from the merchants?
The merchants were very excited to have so many responses, and they have seen some of these results. They haven't seen all of it. I'm hoping to have the full report ready by the next merchant survey or next merchants meeting, which is the second Tuesday in June. But I think even as we were taking we'd take little samples here and there through the survey process, and I'd give them some of that feedback. And they're looking at other ways to try and create more events and add on to the events that they currently have. So they're trying to take it and make some actionable responses off of it.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'd like to know the reasons why we can lower our speed limit downtown.
Reasons.
And that's a general question. I don't know who can answer that or whatever. But I don't want to hear the reasons why we can't. I want to hear the reasons why we can do that and how we can do it.
If I add them up for that, I mean, Main Street is no different than the other street. It has to meet certain warrants to justify that, but he can express to you.
Can't our police chief lower the speed limit for safety purposes?
City
I mean, it seems to
council-
me there
The
should be
city
a lot
council
of ways.
technically can, but it's supposed to be done on an objective basis, safety
When I drive down
related.
there, I'm pretty objective that people are backing right out in front of me, you know?
They look at, traffic
So, but-
accidents in the space, whether there's any pedestrian accidents,
Yeah, I don't want to go into
yeah,
a big
but-
discussion here,
but
but
there are-
hold that as a question
Sure.
to be answered at some future date, please.
Sure, okay.
I understood years and years ago, they did lower at the school in the area for 20 miles an hour, and we were told it was a state highway and you couldn't do that. Because they did.
Main Street was a state highway?
That was the old Highway 50.
Okay.
And they said they lowered it to 20, and I've been here a long time. And they didn't allow them to do it. 30 was the minimum.
And I know when we were visiting Buena Vista and Salida, the speed limits in both of those downtowns, I believe it was 15 miles per hour.
I could be wrong, but that's what we were told. There could be some local lore, too. We do that occasionally. All
I
right.
think we need to look into lowering the speed limit downtown because of, okay, because we have a lot of bicyclists can't ride on the sidewalks anymore. They have to limit it to the streets, and it just puts a lot more happening in that area. So if we can look into it, that'd be great.
Okay. Well, any more questions for Ryan? Thank you, Ryan. It's always very informative. Now, the next Downtown Merchants meeting is at 5:30 on the 12th?
Let me double check here. That is correct. It's 5:30 on the 12th.
Ryan, what's the location going to be on that?
It's currently set for classic furniture, but if I'm going to be presenting, we might relocate that here where I have, to City Hall, where I have, a place where I can actually do some presenting with a screen and slide deck.
I believe
gonna-
there's a
I was gonna-
stormwater task force meeting that day also.
Okay, so we'll look into that and see what, if we need to change venue.
I was going to say, if I might offer for consideration, you guys might think about a city hall location for the meetings, because you might find that just there being more accommodating space and facilities available, maybe there might be a more response of other merchants getting involved.
Sure. Absolutely, I'll make that suggestion.
Okay.
What, is that 5:30?
5:30.
Thank you, Ryan. Shall we
Thank
move
you.
on to our next meeting? We're actually a little early.
Take a little break.
So should we take a 2-minute break?
2 minute?
So our
Can we
Vision
vote on
Committee
that?
meeting is adjourned. You're wasting, I got a minute and a half now. Jim?